Okay, chapter 28, The Affluent Society. When you might have heard your grandparents or even great grandparents say, I wish it was like the good old days. What they're talking about is 1950s in the United States. America in the 1950s is really kind of the golden age of Americana. Everything seems to be looking up for the United States. We are a world leader after World War II. Our economy is booming. We are the world's only nuclear power. Everything is great. Everything in America is picture perfect, except when you begin to chip away at it just a little bit, we're going to find out that beneath the surface, maybe not everything is as great as it seems on the outside. So, broad themes for this chapter. We're going to talk about American society in the 1950s. We'll talk about some technological achievements, how families were living, that sort of thing. We'll talk about a new president. Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be elected as president. So, we'll talk about Ike, as he's known as president. And then at the tail end, we'll get into the very early civil rights movement. We'll cover that more in the next chapter, but the modern civil rights movement certainly gets its start during the 1950s. Okay, so an affluent society. As I mentioned, 1950s in the United States is sort of the golden age of capitalism. Everything is going right for the American economy. Europe is still rebuilding after World War II, so a lot of the resources and materials they need to rebuild, they're looking to the United States to buy from. And so this is the last truly industrialized era for the United States. Now, of course, there will be American manufacturing in the 60s and 70s, and of course, even up until today, there's still lots of factories in the United States. But the vast majority of people today don't work in manufacturing. Most people in the United States today hold service jobs. They don't make something for a living. They do something for a living, right? They're doctors or software engineers or lawyers or teachers. The last truly industrialized era would be the 1950s into the 60s, and certainly by the time we hit around the 1970s, that's definitely dwindling down. But again, this is still the golden age of Americana, so everything is good. And there is an economic boom. Everyone was afraid that after World War II ended, the Great Depression would come back. That's the big fear, right? Government spending during the war ended the Great Depression. Now that the war is over, if that government faucet is turned off, will the Great Depression come back? And turns out that number one, it doesn't, because consumer spending begins to pick up. Everything that people couldn't afford during the Great Depression or World War II, now that we moved into the 1950s, they can afford to buy those things again. And government spending doesn't really drop off either, because now we're in the middle of the Cold War and we still have to build these tanks and planes and guns and bombs, even if we're not actively at war. We think that it could be just over the next horizon. And so we have to keep ourselves prepared so government spending doesn't really drop off either. Not only an economic boom, we see a population boom, the so called baby boom. You see here a chart of birth rates in the United States. And you can see it's a definite decline starting in the early 1900s down through the 19 teens and 20s into the 30s. Spikes back up just a little bit, but then you can see that highlighted section definitely as American servicemen are returning home, they're getting married, they're settling down and starting families. This is the so called baby boom generation where birth rates stayed elevated. And you can see there from probably the mid 40s into really the mid 1960s. So for a solid 20 years there, America is going to experience a higher than average birth rate. And again, these are the so called baby boomers. One very popular feature after World War II was moving out to the suburbs. This was sort of the American dream that was sold to everyone, that you owned your own home, you had your own yard, you've got the dog and the cat and the two kids and a car in the garage. This was the American dream that was sold to people. You no longer have to live in the city where it could be dirty and cramped and there might be pollution and crime. Now you can move out to the suburbs and, like I said, you get married, you start a family, and you settle down. And of course, that is really going to promote economic growth as well, because huge construction boom, and you think about everything that goes into the building of these houses, lumber, raw materials. You've got people buying new consumer appliances like vacuum cleaners and dishwashers, washing machines to put in these new homes. All of this sort of goes hand in hand with the economic boom and the population boom, because now you're starting a family, you need somewhere to live. We see the continued rise of the West. I made mention of this maybe back in the Great Depression video, that one of the areas that really particularly benefited from the New Deal was the West. A lot of like building of hydroelectric dams and irrigation projects, those sorts of things happened out West. Now the big money out West is going to be in oil as the oil industry continues to grow, and the defense industry, because as we continue to make these tanks and planes and guns and bombs, a lot of those factories are going to be in places like California out west, and so they will continue to grow and to prosper. Now, I do want to point out that because of this economic boom, a lot of the criticism that had been leveled against capitalism, especially back in the 1920s, that is now gone. Remember, a lot of people were pretty upset with Wall Street during the Great Depression because they blamed Wall Street and things like the stock market crash, that they blamed those things on the quote unquote businessmen of America, on the Wall Street brokers, right? So when times are tough, they got the blame. Now that times are good, they get the credit. And so a lot of the criticism that had existed in the 1930s, where people were sort of railing against capitalism and the problems that it sometimes prevents, a lot of that is gone. Not all of it, but a lot of that is gone because times are good and people are no longer hurting. Now, the other part of this is that the government is going to fully embrace what are known as Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics, that comes from a guy's name, John Maynard Keynes. He's a British economist, studied the Great Depression, wrote a lot about it. And we see two new types of policies come out of Keynesian economics. It's fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is the idea that government spending can regulate the economy. So the economy, it has its ups and its downs, right? Its booms and its busts. The idea is, in order to smooth that out, the government can regulate its spending. When times are good, it doesn't have to spend as much. When times are bad, it needs to kick in to make up for some of that lost spending, like the Great Depression, right? Consumers weren't spending anything, people weren't spending anything. So through the New Deal and later World War II, the government had to turn on the faucet and pour money into the economy. That's the idea of fiscal policy. To make the highs not quite as high, but the lows not quite as low, the government should smooth out the economy. That's fiscal policy. The other policy is monetary policy, and that's the idea that by controlling the supply of money, because money operates just like anything else, it's supply and demand. The more there is of it, it's worth less. The more supply there is, the less it's worth, right? If something is common, it's usually not worth very much. The less something is, the rarer it is, the more it's worth. That's what inflation is. Money doesn't buy as much as it used to because the economy runs too hot and there's too much money floating around. So the idea behind monetary policy is that by controlling the supply of money through interest rates and financial reserves, buying and selling of government bonds, these things, the government can sort of regulate how much money is out there. And then by doing that, they can help control inflation. So by embracing these two things, fiscal and monetary policy, the government is attempting to smooth out and regulate the economy. So the 1920s, where the government was very hands off the economy, it was very laissez faire. The idea that any government I don't want to say, well, anything the government had to do with the economy was seen as interference. That is no longer the case. Now the idea is the government can help out the economy. Okay. Well, the American standard of living in the 1950s is the best in the world. Things that were once reserved for the rich, like electricity in your home or even like running water in your home, household appliances, those are available for everyone now. And so the idea, it becomes linked in Americans' minds that the business world is giving us equality, right? Freedom and free enterprise become linked in people's minds because the idea is that we can produce ourselves out of poverty. And what I mean by that is if we can just make enough stuff, if we can make enough dishwashers and washing machines and vacuum cleaners, if we can just make enough stuff, everybody can afford to get one, and therefore we're all on the same playing field. And of course, there will always be the haves and the have nots. But if we can just make enough stuff and make it freely available to everyone, we can have social equality. That's the idea. We can produce ourselves out of poverty. We have created a classless society by making cheap goods that are available to everyone. The middle class becomes huge because it is easier than ever to become part of the middle class. And again, it's all sort of that American dream, right? You buy your own home, you have your own car. The man goes off to you live in the suburbs, and then the man travels into the city, and he comes home to his wife who has spent the day caring for their children. That's sort of the middle class American dream that was sold to America during this time. I do want to mention cars because car culture is firmly established in the United States by this point. We really see America embrace the idea of cars, things like drive-in movie theaters, fast food restaurants. These things are all dependent upon the car lifestyle. Even the idea living in the suburbs, driving into the city every day for work, that is still going to be part of the car lifestyle. Let's talk about the American family for just a second. Because the American family, again, this is sort of the golden age of Americana. This is the leave it to beaver United States. And so the perfect family, as it was portrayed, you've got the American businessman. He comes home from work, right? His wife greets him at the door with dinner. They sit down to eat with their two well behaved, very well groomed children. This this was the picture that was kind of sold to the United States as the perfect, quote unquote, the perfect family. Right now, of course, does everyone live this way in reality? No. In fact, the vast majority of people probably don't live this way in reality, but they see that, and that's what they want for themselves. And of course, where do they see that? They see that on TV, this new invention where after dinner, the mom and the dad and the 2.3 children, they sit down and they gather around the TV, and they're shown ideas of what their life ought to look like. We'll come back to the TVs in just a second. Some other major technological achievements: we have antibiotics, new discoveries such as penicillin. We have new immunizations for things like polio and smallpox. These are going to radically transform people's lives. Diseases which once, they ravaged populations, especially these childhood diseases, they are going to be virtually eradicated through the use of modern medical science. As I mentioned, TVs, they are the great leveling tool. They homogenize society, right? People watch TV and they absorb it and they think that's what my life ought to look like. So it's kind of creating these cookie cutter molds, right? And this is what's expected of you. You have your home in the suburbs, you have your family. It all ought to look like this. Your life should fit these particular parameters. It doesn't always, but people are thinking this is what it should look like. Other technological achievements: the earliest computers, military technology. As I mentioned, government investment in military technology continues even into the Cold War, because even though we're not at war, we could be. And so we have to be ready. I do want to point out a new invention known as ICBMs. That stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. These are missiles that you could fire, for example, from the United States and hit a target in the Soviet Union, or vice versa. The Soviet Union could launch a missile that could fly over the ocean and hit the United States. This is a big deal. Previously, in order to, like, for example, when we dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan, we had to load them into a plane, physically fly them over the target, and drop them out of the airplane. That is no longer the case. You can hit a button from the safety and security of your country thousands of miles away, launch the missile, and eradicate your enemies on the other side of the world. That's a huge deal. That is a giant leap forward, and we'll actually come back to that in just a few minutes. The other major technological achievement I want to mention was the launch of Sputnik. Sputnik was the first man-made satellite put into space, and it did not come from the United States. Of course, this is a Russian satellite. They beat the United States into space, and really, Sputnik was what kicked off the space race, because remember, the Soviet Union, they are a major rival of the United States. They detonated their nuclear bomb way before we thought they were going to be able to, and now they've actually beaten us into space. And so America feels like we're falling behind, right? We're behind the eight ball, because they are catching up to and even surpassing us in terms of technology. This is a big deal. And of course, at the time, we didn't know what Sputnik was. We didn't know if it was a weapon system, if the Soviet Union could hit us with giant death lasers from outer space. We didn't know what was going on. All we knew was they seemed like they were winning. And so that is going to kick off a concerted effort in the United States to beat the Soviets into space. That was in 1957. Now, I mentioned earlier, people are being sold on sort of this cookie cutter version of the United States. This is what your family should look like. This is what your job should be. This is how you should live your life. People realize that society is not perfect. And there are a lot of people that don't want to fit into these cookie cutter molds that society expects of them. So we do have some rebellion, some backlash against that. We see a poetry movement in the United States, the Beatniks, or the Beats as they're often known. This is a group of young poets who pretty much criticize society. They're criticizing that idea that we should have this cookie cutter model that everyone fits into. We see things like rock and roll. Rock and roll at its heart was a rebellion against the established norm. They didn't want to do what their parents had did. They wanted to do something different. We begin to see American cities begin to really kind of fall apart as people moved out of the city into the suburbs. It leaves especially the inner cities, empty. There's nobody living there. They're abandoned. And this is known as urban decay, as these cities, I don't want to say rot, but as these cities fall into disuse, it becomes a real problem for a lot of major American cities. Okay, let's switch gears for just a second and talk about politics. As we move into the 1950s, the first presidential election is going to be the election of 1952. And you have to remember where we're at, right? You have to go all the way back to 1932. That was when FDR was first elected. Of course, Roosevelt was elected for 4 terms. He died in his last term. Truman took over. Truman's reelected. It has been 20 years of Democratic presidential control. And so by the time we hit the early 1950s, I think America was ready for a change, and that's going to come in the person of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, here's the thing about Eisenhower. He's not a politician. Of course, his main claim to fame is that he was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. He won the war in Europe, right? But he's a soldier. He's a general. He's not a politician. In fact, I think the presidency was the first elected office he ever ran for. And in fact, nobody knew what political party he belonged to. He was actually approached by both the Democrats and the Republicans. He was so popular, they knew that he was going to win the presidency. Both the Democrats and the Republicans wanted him to run for their party, but he agreed with the Republican platform more. And so he agreed to run for the Republican Party, and he is going to overwhelmingly win the election of 1952. Now, one of his main goals is to distance himself from sort of the old guard Republicans. The old guard Republicans, the Republicans of the 19 teens and the 1920s, still had a lot of the blame for the Great Depression. And he says, no, those were those guys. I'm a new type of Republican. I'm a modern Republican. And the reality was, modern Republicanism is a lot of the same stuff, right? Because the Republican Party has always been a champion of business. They've always been fiscally conservative. They've always wanted a smaller, less powerful government. And so those things are not going to change. But the idea was he wanted to put some distance, at least in people's minds, between the Republicans that he represented and the old Republicans that still got the blame for the Great Depression. Now, that being said, he does get the government involved in the economy, at least to some degree. And probably his biggest accomplishment here is the creation of the interstate highway system. In fact, I want to say that the actual name is the five-star interstate highway system because he was a five-star general. And of course, the interstate system in modern America is the lifeblood. Everything happens on the interstate, right? You send goods by way of trucks, you travel to and from your job, you use them for your get somewhere on a vacation. The interstate highway system is is a big deal. We also see the merger of the AFL and CIO. These were the two largest labor unions in the United States, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And that still exists today, and it's still known as the AFL-CIO. I do want to make mention of the Secretary of State. His name is John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles came up with this idea, and it has to do with ICBMs. It comes up with this idea called massive retaliation or mutually assured destruction. And the idea is this: if you can picture in your mind, you've got the United States and the Soviet Union separated by the Atlantic Ocean, right? And so now we have these missiles that can fly from one continent to the other. The idea is, if, for example, the United States decided to attack the Soviet Union, we press the button, we launch our missiles, they launch out of their silos, and they cross the ocean on their way to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union can detect that. The Soviet Union would know that we had launched our missiles and they were coming towards them. And since the distance is so great, they would have the time to hit their button and launch their missiles before our missiles got to them. And so the idea is this: by building more missiles, you're actually safer. By building more missiles, you're actually making it less likely that the other side will attack, because mutually assured destruction, they know if they launch their missiles, we'll launch ours, and both sides will blow up. And if we launch our missiles, they'll launch ours, and both sides will still blow up again. So as long as we know that the other side can have time to retaliate, we're both going to lose. And nobody wants to do that. And so the idea is the more missiles we have pointed at each other, the safer we actually are. Now, that's the theory. The reality is that people are very paranoid. People are scared. They think the sky is going to start falling on them at any moment. People start building bomb shelters under their houses. School children, like you might have a tornado drill or a fire drill. School children in the 1950s had bomb drills where, the alarm would go off and they would get under their desk and cover their heads and wait for the missile to hit. It's really, in reality, it might have worked, but the idea of it is not great for the American psyche. Okay, I want to talk about Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is a Soviet leader. He comes after Stalin, and he was really the first one in the Soviet Union to stand up and say, hey, Joseph Stalin was not that great of a guy. And of course, if anyone had criticized Stalin while Stalin was alive, They would have disappeared in the night. They would have been executed. They would have ended up in a gulag somewhere, right? Well, now that Stalin is dead and Khrushchev has taken over, the fact that he was open and willing to criticize Stalin was a huge step. And America thought that was a huge step in the right direction. Now, that doesn't mean that things are going to be great between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there's still bad stuff to come. In fact, there's some real bad stuff to come. But at least there for a moment, it looked like there could be a potential thaw with the Soviet Union. It looked like things might be getting just a little bit better just for a minute. We'll come back to that. Like I said, there's still worse stuff to come. But for the moment, things are looking up with Russia. I want to talk about a shift in the focus of the Cold War. For a long time, the question was Europe. What's Europe going to do? How are the battle lines going to be drawn in Europe? Well, by the time we hit the 1950s, we know Western Europe will be allied with the United States, Eastern Europe will be allied with the Soviet Union, and that's pretty set in stone, and that's pretty much done. But the question is, now where can we turn to? We still need allies, we still need alliances. Where can we look outside of Europe? And that's going to be the third world. So in this sort of naming designation, the first world were the United States and their allies. The second world was the Soviet Union and their allies. And the third world are the undecideds. Now, the term third world is not really used anymore. It has kind of a negative connotation because most of these third world countries are developing countries. They're not fully industrialized. They're not fully urbanized yet. And so the United States sees this as a way to actually gain influence with them. What had happened was a lot of the major European empires, they were weakened after World War One, and after World War Two, powers like France and England, they're just not strong enough to keep their colonies anymore. And so we're going to see a wave of decolonization sweep through the world after World War Two. And it creates power vacuums, right? These former colonies, they were once being guided and directed by European powers. Now those European powers are gone, they've pulled out. And the question is, who are they going to look to for guidance? Are they going to look to the United States or are they going to look to the Soviet Union? And the United States wanted to exploit that. We wanted to be the ones to guide them. This is where a lot of American foreign aid spending really originates. And I know if you've seen the news that lots of people talk about the amount of money that America spends overseas, and rightfully so. And, people are needy in the United States, people are hurting in the United States. Why don't we help Americans first? And that's true. That's absolutely true. But it's not all humanitarian reasons. The reason that we do give so much money to foreign aid is not just because we want to be nice and help people out. That's true. But that money also comes with strings attached, right? And so when there's a country, like for example, here in a second, Egypt, when there's a country that wants money to help build a new hydroelectric dam, the United States can step in and say, yeah, sure, we can give you that money. You just remember who your friends are when push comes to shove, right? So a lot of American foreign aid spending does begin during this time because we are looking to buy influence in the third world. Speaking of worldwide events, Ike, as Eisenhower is known, does have a number of foreign crises that he has to deal with as president, one of which is the creation of Israel. After the experience of the Holocaust with the Jewish people during World War II, there was a global push to create a homeland for the Jewish people. And of course, that will culminate in the creation of modern day Israel. The problem with that is that its Arab neighbors were not happy about that. And so, in fact, immediately after Israel is established, its Arab neighbors are going to attack and invade it. It's the very first war. This was in 1948. It's known as the Arab-Israeli War. Israel has been under attack since literally day one. And it was only with the help of her allies, especially the United States, that Israel was able to drive the attackers off to actually win the war. They actually won the 48 Arab-Israeli War. And we'll come back to Israel later. We see action in Iran. America was dependent on foreign oil. We wanted really cheap foreign oil. One of the major oil producers, then as now, is Iran. Well, what we do is we manipulate the internal politics of Iran to establish the Shah of Iran as a supreme leader. So the Shah is kind of like a king. And that office had existed for a long time. But it's kind of like the King of England. You know, they're just a figurehead, they don't have a whole lot of power. Well, we manipulated internal politics to make the Shah of Iran more like an absolute ruler. And that was great for the United States because he really liked the United States. And now that he was the absolute ruler, he could give his friends in the United States a really good deal on oil. So that's great for the United States. The problem is he did not treat his people very well, and he was not beloved. People did not like him at all. And in fact, this will later come back to bite the United States. And the reason that Iran hates the United States today, in the 1970s, the Shah is going to be overthrown in a coup, and the current government of the current government of Iran blames the United States for putting him into power in the first place. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in another chapter. We see issues with Egypt. Egypt was one of these developing countries, and the developing countries were smart. They had learned to play both sides off the middle, right? And so they were one of these undecided countries that the United States is trying to make one of our allies. And so we went to Egypt, and in particular, they wanted money to build a dam, what would become known as the Aswan Dam. They wanted money to build a dam, and so the United States said, okay, we can help you out. And then they went to the Soviet Union, and they said, well, the United States is willing to give us this. What are you guys willing to give us? And that really made the United States mad. And we said, how can you agree to take our money and then you go and you want to buddy up to the Soviet Union? We're taking our money back. Well, that made Egypt really angry. And so in response, they seized control of the Suez Canal, which the Suez Canal is a major worldwide shipping passageway. And they said, well, if you won't give us the money, we'll just start charging money to use the Suez Canal and we'll make money that way. Well, the British didn't like that, and so they sent troops, and then they almost went to war over it. They do eventually stand down. I don't think there was a lot of violence, a lot of bloodshed, but eventually Egypt will turn over control of the Suez Canal back to the British. But that was a major, major thing that Ike had to help deal with. We see problems with Vietnam. And we'll get more into this in the next chapter. Vietnam, before World War II, was a French colony. And now that the war is over, they want their independence, and France says no. And so the United States has to make a choice. France is our military ally. Do we support them, or do we support the revolutionaries? We have a soft spot in our heart for colonists who are fighting for independence. That's how we got our start. And ultimately, we decide that we're going to back France. And of course, we're going to get more and more involved in Vietnam, and eventually we'll be fighting the Vietnam War. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. And then last but certainly not least, a young revolutionary, a young communist revolutionary in Cuba by the name of Fidel Castro is going to launch a revolution against the established government. The established government in Cuba at the time was led by a man by the name of Batista, who was very friendly to the United States. They had invited in American investments, and a lot of Americans owned business in Cuba, and there was a pretty close relationship there. But once again, he did not treat his people well. And so Fidel Castro had broad popular support, and in fact is going to overthrow the Batista government and institute a new socialist government in Cuba, a new communist government in Cuba. This is a huge problem for the United States, right? We're devoted to this idea of containment, that we're supposed to be stopping the spread of communism. And all of a sudden, we have a communist country, like 90 miles off the coast of Florida? This is a big, big deal for the United States. And it's going to cause problems later in the 1960s. We'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, last but certainly not least, let's talk about the early modern civil rights movement. We'll talk more about this in the next chapter, but it's going to start here in the 1950s. 1950s America, of course, is still segregated. And don't get me wrong, things are worse in the southern states, but throughout the country, America is still segregated. Jim Crow is still the law of the land. Segregation, separate but equal, is still for the moment legal. And so a lot of things are going to be happening in the early civil rights movement. I do want you to know about the Warren Court. Earl Warren was the Supreme Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he is going to be in charge of what's known as the Warren Court. That's going to be instrumental in overturning segregation in the United States. The first major case is Brown v. Board of Education. This is in 1954. Brown v. Board of Education is going to reverse separate but equal in education. So remember the idea, going back to Plessy v. Ferguson, you can have separate facilities as long as they were equal. Brown v. Board of Education says that's impossible. The second you separate, the second you have separate facilities, you automatically make them unequal. And so the order was that schools had to be integrated. That's huge. That is going to be a huge change for the United States. And it's not going to stop there, because now that schools are integrated, we'll see that restaurants will be integrated. We'll see that hotels and trains and everything will be integrated. In 1955, we have Rosa Parks, who of course becomes famous. She refuses to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus and is arrested for it. And that is really one of the earliest things that sort of kickstart the early civil rights revolution. Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, will help organize the Montgomery bus boycott to protest segregated bus lines. It will last for over a year. And that is really where Martin Luther King Jr. becomes sort of a household name in the United States. Of course, we do see massive resistance throughout the South. The Southern Manifesto, of which several Southern states signed, that they promise to fight desegregation by any legal means, and truly any means necessary. We see the Central High crisis right here in Arkansas. Central High, of course, is the Little Rock High School, where 9 black students were trying to attend, and the Arkansas governor at the time, his name was Orville Faubus, refused to let them attend school. And they had to call out the National Guard. They had to call out soldiers. Soldiers with guns had to walk these 9 children to school every day to protect them and just make sure it was safe enough that they could go to school. And of course, this makes national headlines. It becomes a major news story all across the United States. And so that brings us up to the election of 1960. And so the 2 men who are running for president in 1960, we have Richard Nixon, who had made a name for himself running the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was in charge of this congressional committee to root out communists in the American government. He was the Republican candidate. He was also Ike's vice president, so he's well known, pretty famous. And then you've got JFK, John F. Kennedy, who is a young senator from Massachusetts. He comes from a very well-connected, very wealthy family. He has sort of been groomed for the presidency since he was a child. And the interesting thing is, this is the first president where the first presidential election where the presidential debates are televised. And it's really interesting because they did studies about this later, and those who listened to it or read about it said it was a tie. Those that watched it overwhelmingly said that Kennedy won. And the thing is, Kennedy just looked more presidential. He was used to being on TV. He knew how to look into the camera, to address the camera. He wore makeup. He was very prepared on what he needed to do. Nixon, by contrast, he didn't. He looked older. He was sweating under the hot lights. He wasn't as well spoken and maybe as fluent as Kennedy was in his responses. And so, yeah, it's interesting that the role of TV in today's politics. Of course, the expectation is, today you have to look presidential. So, anyway, okay, fine. Um, Kennedy's going to win. We'll talk more about Kennedy in the next chapter. But as Eisenhower is leaving office, of course, it's the American tradition, has been since George Washington, that the outgoing president gives what's known as a farewell address. And Ike's farewell address became famous because he warned against what was known as the military industrial complex. Now, remember, he is a former general, he is a military man. But as he's going out the door, he says, keep an eye on that military industrial complex. And what he was saying is this: he says, listen, there's a lot of money tied up in the military. There's a lot of people getting rich from designing and building new tanks and planes and guns and bombs and things of that nature. That's the industrial part. They're building those things for the military. That's the military part. And so there is a symbiotic relationship between the military and people that build things for the military. And so the people that build things want that money. And so they're going to want to continue to stress the need for new tanks and planes and guns and bombs. And the military wants new tanks and planes and guns and bombs. And eventually, if somebody is building them, they're going to want to use them. And then that can justify building more tanks and planes and guns and bombs. He's saying, listen, you better watch out because this is like kind of a self fulfilling prophecy, right? There's a lot of power and a lot of money tied up in this. And you got to keep an eye on it because if that got out of control, you could have real problems later on. And so as we move into the 1960s, sort of the golden age of Americana, you can already kind of see it's kind of fraying at the edges, right? We've got the increasing uh, tension of the Cold War, and it's going to get real bad in the 1960s. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. Increasing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. You've got the growing civil rights movement in the United States. The 1960s is going to be a very turbulent time in the United States. And so, the golden age of Americana, what was it really there in the first place? Does it really last for a long time? I don't know. But we'll talk about that more in the next chapter. But that is the end of chapter 28.